Me here. Can you hear me okay? I'd like you to meet my mother. She was 7 years old when this picture was taken, and at the time it would have been impossible to have guessed that this little tomboy, who demanded to be included in the boys' games, would one day become an iconic fashion model, a woman who bridged the gap from classical photography to modernism, and became the muse and the friend, and often the lover of some of the greatest photographers of the day, including Man Ray. Her modeling career began one day when she was walking through Manhattan. She stepped out in front of an oncoming truck. It was Condé Nast, the owner of Vogue magazine, who saved her. He put her on the front cover of Vogue, March 1927. She was not yet 20 years old. That's how you do it, girls, but make sure the guy's watching. This brought her to the attention of Edward Steichen. Steichen immediately saw the perfect looks for the evening dresses, and for the casual clothes, and for the sportswear. And Steichen's photographs of Lee Miller made her into what we would today call a supermodel, coast to coast, Vogue and Vanity Fair magazines. Ironically, it was this photograph by Steichen that brought Lee Miller's career to a crash stop. It was used in this advertisement for Kotex, women's sanitary products, and this was considered to be absolutely scandalous. It was 1928, and this was a taboo subject. It was also as though she had personally endorsed the product. Well, no couture house wanted the Kotex girl modeling their dresses, so it simply stopped Lee's career, bang, overnight. But Steichen gave her an introduction to Man Ray, and she went on a liner to Paris to find Man Ray, an American surrealist artist and photographer, the most exciting photographer the world has ever known. Lee started modeling for his fashion shots, and almost immediately he fell in love with her. And Man Ray's love for Lee Miller must have been one of the most tempestuous love affairs the world has ever known. Because the root of the problem was the surrealist concept of free love. They believed that sex and love were separated, and anybody could have sex with whoever they liked, regardless of who they were in love with. And the men thought this was a very good idea, but they didn't expect the women to have the same freedom. But Lee wouldn't accept this double standard. She said, "Okay, Man Ray, good enough for you, good enough for me." And she went off and had all the lovers she wanted, and it nearly drove Man Ray mad with jealousy. His anguish actually was creative. It caused him to make some of the most important works of his whole career. When my mother died, I was going through her papers, and I found this page from Man Ray's notebook. His handwriting tumbles backwards and forwards across the page in a wild, swirling script. Elizabeth, Elizabeth, Lee, Elizabeth. It covers the mask-like face of Lee drawn in pencil. When I unfolded this document, I found a photograph tucked inside it. It's an image of Lee's eye, slightly larger than life, and when I looked at it closely, it made me feel very, very cold inside, because I found that on the lower eyelid, he has taken a very sharp pencil and written his signature like a tattoo. It's almost a sadistic act to take a sharp pencil and poke your loved one in the eye. On the reverse, he'd written a poem in red ink. Look at the last line. "The racket must go on, I am always in reserve." Man Ray was a wonderful person, but he had a huge ego. For him to put himself in reserve, it was a major step down. And check the date. That is the date Lee finally left her and returned to America. But their artistic relationship was incredibly productive. One of their most famous discoveries was what Man Ray called solarization. It reverses some of the tones and puts this beautiful black outline around the figure. Lee was developing a negative in total darkness when a rat ran over her foot. She screamed, she turned on the white light. You do not turn on the white light when you're developing negatives. Man Ray saw the negative was being exposed, he snapped the light off, grabbed the negative, and dumped it in the fixer to try and save it. And when they printed it, they found this extraordinary effect. The second accidental exposure of the negative created this striking black line around the light areas. It gives the photograph its strange three-dimensional appearance, like a low relief. And when we look at the photograph, it seems badly composed. There's a lot of dead ground in the front. There's this big hand that's badly placed. But that's deliberate. Man Ray always shot wide so he could crop tight. And this is the image you may have seen before. It's one of his best-known portraits of all, and it's one of the best-known portraits of Lee Miller. Solarization was used by both Lee Miller and Man Ray, and it became the signature of their artistic association. Man Ray generously encouraged Lee's photography. Her early works, some of them taken in the vicinity of the studio, show that she developed a strong surrealist style right from the start. She titled this work, Exploding Hand. It does look like the woman's hand is gone up in a puff of smoke. But in fact, this is the door of the Guerlain Parfumerie. So many of the clientele have been wearing diamond rings that the diamonds have scratched the opaque area onto the glass. Lee's used her camera to cut this image free from its surroundings and give it back to us as a found image. You know how fond of found objects the surrealists were? Well, Lee simply just made this into the found image, the image trouvée. Other images show this technique of finding quirky scenes that reflect her passion for discovering the marvellous in the ordinary. She also explored the world of the dream. So did the surrealists. The background here is a mural in a medical clinic. It shows the doctors and the nurses, but the woman is real. And her baby, dressed in white, blends with the mural. It blurs the distinction between the real and the unreal, just like a dream. I don't believe in trying to interpret these images for you. They are there for you to attach your own meaning. And in part, this is her gift to us, to provoke us, to make us think, to make us have our own conclusions. When we look at Lee Miller's work, it's hard to trace external influences. But if you know the work of Edward Weston, maybe you can see some similarities. And Man Ray, of course, influenced her. But Lee's eye, when photographing women, is the gentle eye of a woman photographing another woman. And Lee seems to respect the power of that woman behind the beauty. And she does less to make her into an erotic commodity, as a man would, photographing the same subject. Lee had a link with this lady, a wonderfully, marvellously crazy surrealist woman called Claude Cahun. Cahun made this self-portrait in about 1925, and Lee saw it and was immediately fascinated, and she made her own preparatory sketch for a photograph because she was taken with the metaphor. You will have seen glass domes. They contain trophies, beautiful things that have been captured and are being shown off to enhance the status of the person who owns them. And Lee photographed her closest friend, Tanja, also a very beautiful woman. And Lee and Tanja hated the way that men wanted to capture them and make them into trophies, to display them as like something to enhance their status, like a museum specimen. This was her protest against those who wanted to take her freedom from her. Man Ray often gave her fashion assignments like this shot, so he could concentrate on his painting. Lee told me her photographs were frequently published, attributed to Man Ray. She said, "It was okay. We were so close. It was as if we were the same person." But there was one momentous occasion when they quarreled in a really big way over attribution. In one of their many sessions, Man Ray took this negative of Lee's neck. He was disappointed, so he threw it out. Lee fished the negative out of the rubbish bin, and it looked a bit unpromising. But she started work. She went through several states of contrast, and finally, it was the cropping that did it. Shoot wide, crop tight. And this is the print she showed to Man Ray. "What do you think of this?" "Wow," he said, "that is amazing." And so it is. But then the fight started. Whose photograph was it? Was it Man Ray's because he took the original negative? Or was it Lee's because she made the print? Well, the row climaxed with Man Ray throwing Lee out of the studio. When she came back 5 days later, she found that a copy of the photograph had been nailed to the studio wall. The throat had been cut with a razor, and red ink streamed down from the cut. Sometime later, Man Ray painted this picture. He called it Logis d'artiste. That means the artist's abode. We can see Lee's neck positioned among the things that he owned, the objects in his studio. He's reduced her to an object, just one more of his possessions. Many of Man Ray's most important works have a direct reference to Lee Miller, and you probably already know this one. It's called Indestructible Object. It's Lee's eye on the pendulum of the metronome ticking away, counting the seconds that she is in the arms of someone else. Finally, after nearly 4 years, Lee grew tired of Man Ray's jealousy, and in December 1931, the same day as on that photograph, she left for New York. It was such a bad time to start a studio in New York. The Depression was terrible. But she began. And she made advertising pack shots for the big stores like Macy's, Bergdorf Goodman. And that French chic style put her way ahead of her rival American photographers. And then the portrait clients began to arrive. Broadway actresses like Lillian Harvey, she was very fresh from a big success in a film, The Congress Nuns. Or aspiring actresses like Mary Taylor. They wanted pictures to send to Hollywood casting directors. The studio was a great success. And just when things were going really well, this guy shows up. His name? Aziz Eloui Bey. He's Egyptian, a businessman who fell in love with Lee in Paris. They were married on the 19th of July, 1934, and Lee went to live in Cairo. To begin with, she loved the easy life. Then, all too soon, she became bored with the monotonous social scene of Cairo. She called these women the Black Satin and Pearls set, and before long she was aching to escape. So she grabbed her Rolleiflex camera and began making long-range journeys into the desert. It was hazardous. The cars were mostly unsuitable for this kind of adventure, and they spent a lot of time getting stuck. She visited the monastery of Wadi Natrun, where the sensuous breast-like domes carry a sense of irony because they are inhabited by celibate Coptic monks. She photographed the shadow of the Great Pyramid, which stretches out over the land and the dwellings of the ordinary people of Egypt, just like the influence of the pharaohs. Her photograph, titled Portrait of Space, has become known as a metaphor for escape and freedom. This is the torn fly screen in a little rest house way out in the western desert. The ruptured hole gives an opportunity for escape down that road. But in the sky, is that a cloud, or is it a white bird flying freely? It's that rectangle that gives the photograph its name. It's a frame for a portrait, but it frames nothing but space. Portrait of space. And you are invited to fill that space with your own thoughts and your own dreams, or your imaginings. After 3 years, not even desert travel could allay Lee's boredom. Aziz, ever-loving, bought her an airline ticket to Paris. Flying was a big adventure in those days, and on the night she arrived in June 1937, she went to a fancy dress ball. And there she met this guy. Very English. Very tweedy English. You know what I mean? He described meeting Lee Miller as like being struck by lightning. He was never the same again. He was quiet, shy, English, and also a surrealist artist. His name was Roland Penrose, and he was later to become my father. They travelled, and they ended up in Mougins on the Côte d'Azur, in a sort of surrealist summer camp. The poet Paul Éluard is there on the left, with his wife Nouche. That's Man Ray wearing the hat. He's with his new lover, Adi. She is the first serious girlfriend in his life in the 5 years since Lee has left him. And that's Roland Penrose in the middle. And this is what an inhibited Englishman looks like when he's in Provence with the woman of his dreams. There should have been 2 other people there that day, Picasso and Dora Maar. But they had a huge quarrel that morning. They needed time to cool off. Picasso was really enamored with Lee, and she became his muse briefly, and he painted her portrait. This is what she looked like 10 years on from being a supermodel. And this is how he painted her. Look at her eyes in the painting. Do you think she's crying? She's holding a letter. Maybe the letter has some bad news in it. Well, you might be right. The fighting in the Spanish Civil War was at its worst in this moment, and only a few weeks earlier Picasso had just finished painting the masterwork of the last century, Guernica. It was his protest against the bombing of the little Basque town that killed or injured nearly 3,000 people. Roland toured that painting around England. There were 3 venues. The last was in the working class place of Whitechapel in London. And that drew the biggest audience, and it brought the attention that Roland wanted. But by then it was too late. The war was nearly over. But in Picasso's work, you can see the parallel of great tragedy and great joy is often there. And in this series, he continues to celebrate the joy of Lee, of being around her. And he painted her as a woman from Arles, because the women from Arles are known for their very great beauty. It is true. If you don't believe me, go see for yourself. And from the yellow background in this one, we're reminded that Van Gogh also painted his Arlésienne. This is his portrait of Madame Ginou. He painted her 6 times. Picasso painted Lee 6 times. Both artists noted the little hats that the women wear. They still wear them to this very day. And also the beautiful lace-trimmed fichu. If you go there, you may see them wearing it. We don't know the exact order or the dates of the portraits, but the last one is dated the 23rd of September. Lee and Roland had left Mougins 5 days earlier. Picasso was still painting Lee Miller 5 days after she had gone. Roland bought this one, and he gave it to my mother as a present. When I was a child, it hung in our home, and it was so embarrassing. My school friends would come. They would look at it. Does your mother really look like that? My God, she's scary. But as I grew older, I began to decode the painting. Do you see she has a bright yellow face? Yeah. You see, she was this warm person. Everybody knew that. She had this warm heart. But she was incredibly intelligent. She had this bright intellect. Picasso has given her sunshine yellow for her face, for the warmth of her personality, and the brilliance of her intellect. Later I found that if I took a profile photograph of Lee and I drew around it, it matched the painting almost exactly, but it doesn't quite fit around the chin, does it? No, you see, in the painting she's got her mouth open, making that great big toothy grin. Check the grin. See what I mean? Isn't it amazing how much of Lee Picasso has put into that painting? In 1939, Lee left Aziz and she went to London. Bad timing. She arrived just as the Second World War began, and she moved in with Roland Penrose in London. Almost immediately she got a job as a Vogue magazine photographer, but she became bored with taking fashion pictures, so she went out in the street. She called this Remington Silent. It was a quiet typewriter, but no, it's not silent now, because that photograph is giving us thousands of words about the destruction of war. There was always humour. These two proud geese seem to be posing in front of their egg. It's actually really a grounded air defense balloon. In 1942, the United States of America entered the war, and their armed forces began arriving in very large numbers. But among them was this guy, already well known to Life magazine, a photojournalist. His name was David E. Sherman. Sherman and Lee met as two Yanks in Britain, and very soon, with Roland's blessing, Sherman moved into their home in Hampstead, and it began a ménage à trois. Roland was away a lot. You can see now he's a soldier. He wanted there to be somebody around Lee who loved her as much as he did, in case the bombs should come too close and she should be hurt. Then there would be somebody around who would look after her in any circumstances. Those guys remained such close friends right to the end of my father's life. But it was Sherman who suggested Lee apply for military accreditation. She was soon equipped with a chic uniform and this special pass card which gave her access to military areas. Her first overseas assignment was 6 weeks after D-Day. She flew into France to do a story on the 44th Evacuation Hospital at Breckville. That's just behind Omaha Beach. On her return to England, she filed 35 rolls of film and 10,000 words, and established her domination of Vogue features for the next year and a half. She'd gone to the furthest reaches of her assignment, right up close to the enemy lines, and her photographs give us a sense of her human compassion for the wounded and their carers. She was seldom interested in generals and the top brass. She wanted to be where the action was, and she felt at her most comfortable with people like these, the ordinary soldiers. One evening, she was walking through the tent hospital. She heard a voice call out to her faintly, "Hey, lady, "Take my picture, I guess I look pretty funny." Lee wrote that she hoped her expression did not give away the horror she felt when she turned and saw this man who was a Burns victim. She also wrote that she didn't focus good. We think he died that night. A few weeks after filing the Normandy Nurse's story, Lee was back in France. This time she was covering the siege of Saint-Malo. She witnessed a horrific infantry assault on the main citadel, Fort de la Cité, and she reported it like this. This is what she wrote for Vogue magazine. The boy at the phone said, "They hear airplanes." We waited. Then we heard them swelling the air like I've heard them vibrating over England on some such mission. This time they were bringing their bombs to the crouching stonework 700 yards away. They were on time, bombs away, a sickly death rattle as they straightened themselves out and plunged into the citadel. Deadly hit. For a moment, I could see where and how, and then it was swallowed up in smoke, mushrooming, columning, towering up, black and white. Our house shuddered, stuff flew in at the window, more bombs, crashing, thundering, flashing like Vesuvius, the smoke rolling away in a sloping trail. A third lot, the town reeled in the blast. A large breach had been made. We waited for the next attack. I sheltered in a kraut dugout, squatting under the ramparts. My heel ground into a dead, detached hand. I cursed the Germans for the sordid, ugly destruction they had conjured up in this once beautiful town. I wondered where my friends that I had known here before the war were, how many had been forced into disloyalty and degradation, how many had been shot, starved, or what. I picked up the hand, hurled it across the street, and ran back the way I'd come, bruising my feet, crashing in the unsteady piles of stone and slipping in blood. Christ, it was awful. Yeah, it must have been awful. But it was only a small taste of the horrors yet to come. In the meantime, there was a respite as Lee covered the liberation of Paris. She went to find Picasso. He whirled her off her feet, exclaiming, "C'est incroyable! This is incredible! The first Allied soldier I have seen is a woman, and she is you." That had to be a surreal moment for Picasso. She got a room in the Hotel Scribe. It was the Allied press camp. Sherman moved in the next door, and together they followed the fighting across Europe. They made an incredible team. Marguerite O'Higgins of the New York Herald Tribune complained to Sherman, "How is it every time I arrive to cover a story, I find you and Lee Miller just leaving?" The list of their assignments reads like the battle orders of a famous regiment. The Alsace towns of Colmar and Neuf-Brisach, Strasbourg, the sunshine thrill of liberation, Cologne Cathedral, the oldest cathedral in Europe nearly reduced to rubble, Frankfurt, the bridges over the Main were blown. People had to queue for hours to get across in small boats. Ludwigshafen, the chemical works destroyed by Allied bombing. Can you see in the middle? That's a soldier standing there. That gives you an idea of the scale. Leipzig, the burgomaster, his wife, and his daughter killed themselves rather than be captured. Lee noted the girl had exceptionally pretty teeth. Through the winter of '44, the Allies had fought like crazy. The Germans had their backs to their own frontier. And finally, the war began to go in the Allies' favour. They stormed across the plains, through the heartland of Germany, heading for Munich. And Lee's surrealist eye was always present, and unexpectedly among the reportage, the mud and the bullets, we find photographs where the unreality of war assumes an almost lyrical beauty. This photograph has the stillness of a painting by Giorgio de Chirico. And here we see a landscape that might have been painted by Yves Tanguy. On reflection, I realized the only really meaningful training for a war correspondent is first, to be a surrealist, because then nothing that you encounter is too unusual.